A sleek obsidian beast, an armored Cadillac Escalade with tinted windows, dark enough to hide a soul sliced through the rotting heart of Black Creek, like a funeral hearse made of diamonds. Inside the climate-controlled silence of the cabin, Henry Cole sat motionless. At 32, he was a titan of industry, a master of the universe, whose whisper could crash Asian markets. But right now, his eyes were hollow pits, reflecting the gray decay rolling past the glass. He wore a bespoke Tom Ford suit that cost $6,000 more than the annual income of the families living in the rusted trailers lining the road. The vehicle dipped violently as it hit a crater in the asphalt. Black Creek, West Virginia, was no longer a town. It was a carcass picked clean by coal barons and opioids. Boarded-up storefronts stared back at Henry like eye sockets in a skull. The old cinema was now a meth clinic. The diner where he'd had his first date was a pile of charred timber. Henry loosened his silk tie, feeling the familiar, suffocating grip of survivor's guilt tighten around his throat. He wasn't returning for a holiday. He was returning because the zeros in his bank account had finally reached a number high enough to bribe his own conscience. He had come to face the ghost he had left behind. He pressed his hand against the cold window, and instantly the luxury leather interior dissolved. 10 years ago, the Greyhound bus station. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. The rain had been torrential that night, smelling of diesel and wet coal ash. Sarah was standing on the curb, shivering in a cardigan, so threadbare it was practically transparent. She was 20, beautiful in a tragic, fragile way, like a wildflower growing in a slag heap. "You go, Henry," she had whispered, her voice cracking. "You go and you become something. Don't look back." Henry remembered looking down at his hands. She had pressed a crumpled wad of cash into his palm. $50. It was all ones and fives, greasy, crinkled tips she had saved from double shifts at the diner. She needed that money for her father's insulin. She needed it for heat, but she gave it to him so he could eat on his first week at NYU. "I'll come back for you, Sarah," he had promised. A lie. A damn lie. "Just go," she had said, pushing him onto the bus as she stepped back into the shadows of a life he was fleeing. That $50 was the seed capital of the coal empire. Every billion he made since was built on the back of a girl who starved so he could feast. "Sir, we're here." The driver's voice snapped Henry back to the present. The Escalade slowed, turning onto a freshly paved private drive that spiraled up the only hill in town. Looming ahead was the Cole Estate. It was a grotesquely magnificent structure, a neoclassical monstrosity of white marble and pillars that Henry had paid to have built remotely for his mother. It sat perched above the squalor of the valley like a feudal fortress, an insult to the suffering below. The iron gates swung open with a silent, hydraulic hiss. Henry felt a wave of nausea rise in his gut, sour and hot. He looked at the Rolex on his wrist, ticking away seconds that Sarah would never see. He had conquered Wall Street, he had destroyed competitors and bought politicians. But as the car came to a halt in the shadow of the house he bought, but never visited, Henry Cole realized the sickening truth. He was a fraud. He had returned with the ransom of a king, ready to buy forgiveness, but he had arrived 10 years too late to save the only thing that made the money worth printing. He stepped out of the car, his Italian leather shoes touching the soil of his homeland, and felt not like a hero returning, but like a thief visiting the scene of the crime. The massive oak double doors of the estate didn't just open. They were thrown wide as if announcing the second coming. Martha Cole burst onto the porch, a riot of color against the stark white columns. She was draped in a Versace silk blouse that screamed of money but whispered nothing of taste, her neck weighed down by gold chains thick enough to anchor a boat. In a town where neighbors were rationing heating oil, Martha looked like she had just looted a palace. "My son, the billionaire is home." she shrieked, her voice shrill enough to peel the paint off the porch railing. She waved frantically at the empty street, performing for an audience of ghosts and resentful neighbors peering through cracked blinds. Henry stood frozen by the escalade, his body rigid. He watched his mother descend the stairs, not with the hurried steps of a longing parent, but with the strut of a peacock claiming its territory. She crashed into him, a cloud of cloying expired Chanel No. 5 engulfing his senses. She wrapped her arms around his neck. But there was no heartbeat in the embrace. It was a transaction. Henry felt her cold fingers slide down his wrist, lingering not on his skin, but on the cold metal of his Patek Philippe watch. She tapped the sapphire face twice, her eyes gleaming with a predatory satisfaction. "Patek," she cooed, pulling back to inspect him like a prize racehorse. "Finally! The Rolex you wore last Christmas was so pedestrian." "Hello, Mother," Henry said, his voice dry as dust. He gently but firmly peeled her hands off him. "Come inside, the neighbors are watching. Let them see what success looks like," she hissed, grabbing his elbow and dragging him into the house. If the outside was a fortress, the inside was a mausoleum. The foyer was vast, cold and utterly soulless. The air smelled of industrial lemon cleaner and something stagnant, like flowers left too long in a vase. Henry looked around, his stomach tightening. The furniture was oversized, baroque, and gilded monstrosities of velvet and gold leaf that looked like props from a bad period drama, and they were all covered in thick, crinkling plastic. "Don't touch the upholstery, Henry," Martha warned, seeing his gaze. "That's Italian import. We don't want dust on the velvet." Henry walked further into the living room, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. This wasn't a home. It was a stage set built for an audience of one. There were no books, no throw blankets, no signs of life. It was a temple erected to worship the god of appearances. He moved toward the grand fireplace, the centerpiece of the room. The mantel was dominated by a 5-foot oil painting of Martha herself, posed regally with a greyhound she didn't own. Flanking the portrait were framed magazine covers. Henry on Forbes, Henry on Fortune, Henry on the Wall Street Journal. He scanned the rest of the room, the side tables, the walls, the shelves. Nothing. "Where is she?" Henry asked, his back to his mother. Martha was busy fluffing a plastic-covered pillow. "Who, dear? The maid. I fired her. Caught her stealing sugar." "Sarah," Henry said, the name tearing out of his throat like a jagged stone. "Where is Sarah? I sent you $50,000 specifically for a memorial. I asked for her photo on the mantel. I asked for a candle to be lit." The room went silent, save for the hum of the central air conditioning that cost more to run than the average Black Creek annual salary. Martha straightened up, her face hardening into a mask of disdain. The performative joy vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating look of a woman who viewed human beings as investments. "Oh, Henry, don't be morbid," she scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "We don't put bad investments on the mantle. It ruins the feng shui." Henry turned slowly. "Bad investment?" "She was weak stock, honey. I told you that in high school," Martha said, walking over to pour herself a drink from a crystal decanter. "And frankly, it's shameful. I wasn't going to have a junkie staring at me while I drink my tea." The word hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. "Junkie," Henry repeated, his voice dangerously low. "Overdose, Henry. That's how the trash takes itself out." She took a sip, her eyes narrowing over the rim of the glass. "Needles. Filth. She died in the gutter, just like her daddy. You should be thanking me for handling the disposal so quietly." A red haze descended over Henry's vision. Sarah, the girl who worked double shifts on swollen feet, the girl who never even took aspirin for a headache because it cost too much, the girl who saved him. Overdose. The lie was so vile, so blatantly impossible, that it snapped the tether of Henry's restraint. He grabbed a heavy crystal vase from the nearest table, a tacky, glittering thing worth $2,000, and hurled it across the room. Crash! The vase shattered against the wall inches from Martha's head, exploding into a shower of glass dust. The sound was like a gunshot in the sterile silence. Martha screamed, dropping her drink. "Have you lost your mind? That was Waterford." "I don't care about your glass," Henry roared, his voice shaking the crystal chandelier above. "Do not lie to me. Sarah never touched a drug in her life. She was a saint who starved so you could live in this palace of garbage." He marched toward her, the master of the universe replacing the grieving son. His eyes were dark voids of fury. "Cancel the caterers," he commanded, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "Cancel the party. There will be no dinner." But the mayor is coming," Martha stammered, shrinking back against the plastic-covered sofa. "I don't give a damn about the mayor," Henry spat. "Get your coat. You are taking me to her grave. Right. Now." "It's dark, Henry. The mud. Now!" Henry screamed, the sound echoing through the empty, heartless mansion. "Or I burn this house to the ground with us inside." The echo of Henry's ultimatum hung in the foyer, sharp as the shards of crystal scattered across the marble floor. Now. Martha Cole's face, previously flushed with the exertion of her performance, drained of all color until it matched the white walls of her fortress. It wasn't the rage in her son's eyes that terrified her. It was the destination. She scrambled to block the heavy oak doors, spreading her arms wide in a desperate, frantic pantomime of concern. Her gold bracelets clattered together like skeletal chimes. "You can't go up there tonight, Henry. It's impossible," she stammered, her voice pitching up an octave. "The storm last week, it washed the road out. It's a landslide of mud and filth. And the snakes. Oh, God, the copperheads are swarming this time of year." She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at his feet. "Look at those shoes, Henry. Those are Italian leather. You step 1 foot on that path, and you'll ruin $1,000 in seconds. Let's wait for the landscapers. They're coming tomorrow at 8. They'll clear a path for us. Please, baby, just be reasonable." Henry didn't blink. He didn't even look at his shoes. He looked through her, his gaze dismantling her excuses like a forensic accountant stripping bare a fraudulent ledger. "Move," he said, his voice flat. "I can't let you do this," Martha shrieked, her eyes darting to the hallway that led to the kitchen. She nodded sharply at a shadow lingering in the doorway. "Buck, help me talk sense into him." Heavy boots thudded against the pristine floor. Buck emerged from the shadows like a bear waking from hibernation. He was the estate's handyman, a hulking mass of muscle in a grease-stained Carhartt jumpsuit, with knuckles tattooed with faded ink and a history that likely involved state penitentiaries. Martha kept him around for intimidation, a guard dog for her fragile ego. Buck stepped between Henry and the door, crossing arms as thick as tree trunks. He smelled of stale tobacco and unwashed flannel, a pungent contrast to Henry's crisp scent of sandalwood and money. "Now, Mr. Cole," Buck drawled, his voice a gravelly rumble meant to rattle bones. He loomed over Henry, using his size as a weapon. "You need to listen to your mama. It ain't safe out there. The road is closed. You sit down, have a drink, and cool off." It was a physical threat wrapped in polite country phrasing. Henry didn't take a step back. He didn't flinch. On Wall Street, Henry faced down federal prosecutors and hostile boardrooms daily. A hired thug in a dying coal town was a rounding error in his calculations. Henry stepped into Buck's personal space, closing the distance until he was inches from the man's chest. He tilted his head slightly, his expression one of bored lethargy. "Buck, is it?" Henry asked softly. "Let me explain the economics of this situation." "Sit down, boy," Buck warned, uncrossing his arms. "I ruin men more powerful than you before my morning coffee," Henry continued, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "If you do not step aside in the next 3 seconds, I will not fight you. I will simply buy the bank that holds the mortgage on your mother's house and evict her tomorrow. Then, I will hire a team of lawyers to audit every tax return you've ever filed and every parole violation you've ever committed. I will spend $1 million just to ensure you spend the next decade in a federal cage. Henry checked his Patek Philippe. You have 1 second. The color drained from Buck's face. The threat wasn't physical, it was existential. Buck looked into Henry's hazel eyes and saw something colder than violence. He saw the absolute crushing weight of capital. Buck stepped aside. He didn't just move, he shrunk. I ain't getting paid enough for this, Buck muttered, retreating into the kitchen. Martha let out a gasp of betrayal. Henry reached for the door handle, threw it open, and walked out into the biting wind. Outside, the Cadillac Escalade was idling, the driver waiting to whisk them away in comfort. The driver rushed to open the rear door. No, Henry said, slamming the car door shut. Henry, please, Martha wailed, stumbling out onto the porch, clutching her fur coat around her like armor. It's 2 miles, it's freezing. We walk, Henry commanded, turning his back on the luxury vehicle. You want to show off your son to the town? Let's give them a show. He began to walk down the winding driveway, his stride long and purposeful. Martha, hyperventilating and wobbling on 4-inch stilettos, had no choice but to follow. The walk was a descent into hell. As they left the gated sanctuary of the estate and entered the town proper, the atmosphere shifted. The wind howled through the gaps in the boarded-up windows. The streetlights flickered, buzzing like dying insects. Henry walked with his head high, but his heart was hammering against his ribs. They passed the old barber shop, now empty. They passed the high school, where the football field was overgrown with weeds. And then he felt them. The eyes. In the shadows of porches and behind cracked curtains, the people of Black Creek were watching. But it wasn't the admiration Martha had promised. There was no applause for the returning billionaire. A group of men stood outside the liquor store, warming their hands over a barrel fire. Henry recognized one Tom Miller, a guy he used to play baseball with. Henry nodded, a reflex of familiarity. Tom didn't nod back. He spat on the ground and turned his back, pulling his collar up. A woman walking a thin dog crossed the street specifically to avoid them, clutching her coat tight, her eyes wide, not with envy, but with pity. The silence was deafening. It wasn't the quiet of a sleepy town. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a secret being kept. They looked at Henry Cole, not as a success story, but as something grotesque. They looked at him and his mother parading in her furs, while stumbling through the potholes with a mixture of deep, abiding disgust and sorrow. Henry slowed his pace. The cold air bit at his face, but the chill in his gut was colder. Why were they looking at him like he was the monster? He was the one who made it out. He was the one who sent money back, unless the money never arrived. Unless the story they knew was different from the life he thought he was living. He stopped in the middle of Main Street, forcing Martha to crash into his back. "Keep walking, Henry, they're just jealous," Martha hissed. Breathless and sweating despite the cold, grabbing his arm to pull him forward. "Don't look at the trash, eyes on the prize." Henry shook her off, but he kept walking. The dread in his stomach hardened into a lead weight. He wasn't walking toward a grave anymore. He was walking toward a truth that the entire town knew, and he was the only fool left in the dark. The paved road ended at the wrought iron gates of the First Baptist Church Cemetery. Inside those gates, granite angels wept over the resting places of Black Creek's coal barons and local deacons, their names etched in stone that would last centuries. Henry moved to push the gate open, his hand reaching for the latch. "No, not that way," Martha said, her voice tight, pointing a trembling finger toward a deer trail disappearing into the dense, overgrown woods bordering the churchyard. Henry stopped. He looked at the manicured lawn of the cemetery, then at the tangled briars of the forest edge. "You said you bought a plot. I sent $50,000 for the plot alone, Martha. The hillside view section. There were complications, Martha said, pulling her fur coat tighter as the wind whipped her hair across her face. Zoning issues. The ground was too rocky. Come on, Henry, it's just through here. She stepped into the mud, her high heels sinking immediately. Henry followed, a cold knot of dread tightening in his chest. They weren't walking toward the VIP section, they were walking toward the Potter's Field, a term Henry hadn't heard since childhood. It was the shameful strip of land behind the church property line, reserved for drifters, unbaptized infants, and the unidentified dead. They walked for 10 minutes in silence, branches snagging Henry's $6,000 suit. The woods smelled of wet decay and stagnation. Here, Martha said, stopping abruptly. She gestured vaguely at a clearing filled with trash, dead goldenrod and creeping vines. Henry looked around. Where? Right there in front of you, she said, taking a step back as if the ground itself were contagious. Henry looked down. There was no marble angel. There was no granite slab. There was only a sinking, uneven mound of earth, barely distinguishable from the surrounding forest floor. A discarded fast food cup lay near the foot of the grave. At the head, driven crookedly into the mud, was 2 pieces of rotting lumber nailed together to form a crude cross. Written on the crossbar in fading black permanent marker were 2 words, S. Cole. The world tilted on its axis. Henry felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him dizzy. He stared at the marker, the kind of marker you would put over a buried hamster, not a human being, not a wife. Where is it? Henry's voice was a whisper, terrifying in its quietness. Where is what, dear? The money, Henry roared, spinning on his heels to face her. The sound frightened a flock of crows from the trees. I wired you $200,000, Martha. I sent 50 for the plot, 50 for the stone, and 100,000 for the medical bills you said she racked up. Where's the marble? Where's the dignity? Martha flinched, but her eyes remained hard, calculating. She didn't look ashamed. She looked annoyed that she had to explain finances to a billionaire. Civil forfeiture, Henry, she spat back, the lie rolling off her tongue with practiced ease. Sarah was in debt up to her eyeballs. When she died, the state came for everything. They said she owed back taxes, loans, liens. If I had spent a dime of your money on a headstone, the IRS would have seized the house. I had to protect our assets. She was a waitress, Henry screamed, tears finally spilling over his cheeks. What assets? What liens? She was a junkie, Martha yelled, stepping forward, her face twisted in a snarl. Junkies have debts, Henry. I saved you from the scandal. I buried her here because it was humble. It's what she would have wanted. She knew she didn't belong with the good families up the hill. Henry looked at his mother, really looked at her, and saw a monster draped in Versace. You stole it, Henry choked out. You stole her funeral. You stole her peace. He turned his back on her. He couldn't look at her anymore without wanting to commit a crime. He fell to his knees in the mud. The wet, freezing sludge soaked instantly through the knees of his trousers, ruining the fabric, but Henry didn't care. He crawled forward until he was hovering over the mound of dirt. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a platinum locket from Tiffany & Co. It wasn't flashy. It was simple, elegant, and timeless. Inside the locket was a picture of them at their senior prom. Sarah in a dress she sewed herself, Henry in a rented tuxedo, both of them smiling with a hope that now felt like a cruel joke. I'm sorry, Henry sobbed, his voice breaking into a guttural wail that echoed through the hollow. I'm so sorry, Bluebird. I was too late. I have everything, and I have nothing. He didn't use a shovel. He used his bare hands. Henry Cole, the man who moved millions with a keystroke, dug into the freezing West Virginia clay with his manicured fingers. He clawed at the earth, breaking his nails, dirtying his skin, tearing away the roots and the weeds until he had made a small sacred hollow in the center of the grave. He kissed the locket one last time, the cold metal against his feverish lips, and placed it gently into the earth. "I promise you," he whispered to the dirt, "I will burn the world down to make this right." He began to cover the locket, packing the mud down with trembling hands, unaware that 20 feet away, in the dense underbrush, a pair of small hazel eyes were watching him with intense curiosity. The silence of the potter's field was not broken by a prayer, but by the harsh, metallic crunch of aluminum being crushed against stone. Henry Cole froze, his hands still buried in the freezing mud covering the locket. He blinked the tears from his eyes and turned his head toward the dense thicket of rhododendrons bordering the clearing. A twig snapped, loud as a gunshot in the winter air. From the shadows of the underbrush, a figure emerged. It was a child, a girl, no older than 7, dragging a burlap sack that scraped heavily against the frost-hardened ground. She looked less like a child and more like a specter of the Great Depression. She was dressed in a grease-stained mechanic's jumpsuit that was 3 sizes too big, the cuffs rolled up with silver duct tape. Her boots were split at the seams, wrapped in plastic grocery bags to keep out the wet. Henry slowly pulled his hands from the earth, wiping the graveyard dirt onto his ruined trousers. He stared at the girl, and the girl stared back. She didn't look at his $6,000 suit. She didn't look at the platinum watch. Her eyes were locked with laser-like intensity on the foil wrapper sticking out of Henry's breast pocket, a gourmet protein bar he had grabbed from the private jet that morning. But it wasn't her hunger that stopped Henry's heart. It was her face. Underneath the smudge of coal dust on her cheek, her eyes were a piercing, familiar shade of hazel, flecked with gold. They were his eyes. Henry felt a phantom jolt in his chest, a biological resonance he couldn't explain. He saw the hollows of her cheeks, the sharpness of her jaw, the unmistakable signature of starvation that he remembered from his own childhood reflections in shop windows. "Hey," Henry said, his voice raspy from crying. He didn't stand up. He stayed on his knees to be at eye level. He slowly pulled the protein bar from his pocket. "You hungry?" The girl hesitated, gripping her sack of scrap metal tighter. The sack clinked copper wire and crushed beer cans. Scavenging. She was scrapping to survive. "It's chocolate and peanut butter," Henry said softly, tossing the bar gently onto the leaves between them. "Take it. It's okay." The girl's wariness broke. She lunged forward, snatching the bar with a speed that spoke of desperation. "Get away!" The scream came from behind Henry, shattering the moment. Martha Cole rushed forward, her face twisted into a mask of sheer terror that looked bizarrely like rage. She waved her arms, her fur coat flapping like the wings of a vulture. "Get away, you little river rat!" Martha shrieked, positioning herself between Henry and the child. "Don't you touch him, you filthy little animal!" The girl flinched violently, dropping the protein bar. She scrambled backward, tripping over her own oversized boots, terror flooding her small face. Henry stood up, towering over his mother. "Martha, stop it! She's just a child!" "She's a thief!" Martha yelled, her voice trembling with a panic that seemed disproportionate to the situation. She raised her hand as if to strike the air, trying to shoo the girl away like a stray dog. "They come up from the bottoms to steal from the graveyard. Get out! Go on, get!" The girl scrambled to her feet, clutching her sack. But she didn't run immediately. She looked from the screaming woman in the fur coat to the tall man with the sad eyes. She looked at the fresh pile of dirt Henry had just patted down. "Mister?" the girl asked, her voice small and trembling. Henry pushed past his mother, ignoring her clawing hands. "It's okay," he said, stepping toward the girl. "She won't hurt you. I'm visiting someone." The girl tilted her head, confusion knitting her brow. She pointed a dirty finger at the mound of earth, the grave marked S. Cole. "Why are you crying over Miss Jane's dog?" she asked. The world seemed to stop spinning. The wind died. The crows went silent. Henry blinked, certain he had misheard. "What did you say?" "Miss Jane," the girl repeated, wiping her nose on her sleeve. She lives in the trailer behind the church. She buried her dog, Buster, right there last week. I saw her. It was a big old hound. Buster. Henry looked at the cross. S. Cole. He looked back at the girl. A dog? Yeah, the girl nodded innocently. Miss Jane couldn't afford a stone, so she just used wood. A cold electric shock shot down Henry's spine, turning his blood to ice. He slowly turned his head to look at Martha. Martha's face had gone from pale to a sickly shade of gray. The panic in her eyes was no longer about social status. It was the primal fear of a cornered animal. "She's crazy!" Martha shrieked, her voice cracking. She fumbled wildly in her purse, her hands shaking so hard she dropped her lipstick. She pulled out a crisp $100 bill of fortune in Black Creek. "Here!" Martha yelled, crumpling the bill and throwing it at the girl's feet. "Take it. Go buy some candy. You hear me? You're confused. You're a retard. Get out of here before I call the police." The girl looked at the money, then at the terrifying woman. The aggression was too much. She snatched the bill from the mud, grabbed her sack of cans, and sprinted into the dark woods like a frightened deer. "Wait!" Henry called out, taking a step forward. But she was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the Appalachia. Henry stood alone in the clearing, the girl's words echoing in his mind like a curse. Miss Jane's dog. He looked down at the grave he had just wept over, the grave he had poured his soul into, the grave his mother claimed held the love of his life. "Martha," Henry said. His voice was no longer the voice of a son. It was the voice of a prosecutor. He turned slowly to face her. "Who is Miss Jane?" "Who is Miss Jane?" Henry repeated, the question hanging in the frigid air like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. Martha didn't answer. She was hyperventilating, her hands clutching the collar of her fur coat as if strangling an invisible snake. She's nobody. Just some hillbilly trash living in the woods. Don't listen to a child, Henry. That girl is mentally disturbed. The inbreeding in this county is rampant." Henry ignored her. He turned his back on his mother and looked down at the burlap sack the little girl had abandoned in her terror. It sat in the mud, a pathetic lump of refuse that no billionaire should ever touch. "Henry, we are leaving," Martha screeched, grabbing his shoulder. "My feet are freezing and I will not stand here while you rummage through garbage." Henry shrugged her hand off with a violent twitch of his shoulder, not even looking at her. He crouched down, his $6,000 suit straining at the seams. He grabbed the bottom of the dirty sack and upended it onto the wet leaves. A cascade of crushed aluminum cans clattered out, followed by coils of stripped copper wire, the currency of the desperate. But amidst the metal junk, a heavy rectangular object thudded softly against the earth. It was a sketchbook. It was a cheap, spiral-bound pad, the kind sold at dollar stores, its cover warped by humidity and stained with grease. Henry reached for it, his hands trembling. "Don't touch that filth!" Martha cried out, lunging for it. Henry slapped her hand away. The sound was sharp, shocking them both. He didn't apologize. He picked up the book. He opened the cover. The first few pages were filled with rough sketches of birds' hawks circling, crows on a wire. The technique was raw but undeniable. The shading was precise. The anatomy was perfect. A 7-year-old child did not draw this. He turned the page. His breath hitched. It was a charcoal drawing of the Greyhound bus station. But it wasn't just a building. It was a memory captured in soot. The perspective was from the shadows of the overhang, looking out at a bus disappearing into sheets of rain. The taillights were streaks of light on wet asphalt. It was the exact view Sarah would have had the night he left her. He turned the page again. A massive oak tree with a split trunk. The lightning tree by the creek where they had carved their initials in the summer of 2008. He turned the page again, faster now, the paper crinkling under his frantic fingers. And there he was. It was a portrait. It wasn't Henry Cole, the billionaire, with the hard eyes and the lines of stress etched around his mouth. It was Henry Cole at 22. The jawline was softer, the eyes full of naive ambition, the hair messy. It was drawn with such aching tenderness, such intimate knowledge of the curve of his lip and the arch of his brow, that it felt like a caress across time. Henry stared at his own face, drawn in charcoal by a ghost. His eyes drifted to the bottom right corner of the page. There was no signature, no Sarah, just a tiny solitary symbol drawn with a single continuous line, a bluebird. The air left Henry's lungs. Bluebird. It was the private name he had given her in high school because she was so small, so fragile, yet she sang when she thought no one was listening. "She's alive," Henry whispered. The realization didn't bring joy. It brought a seismic shock that nearly knocked him over. "Henry, put that down." Martha's voice was now a low, dangerous hiss. She had stopped acting. She stood rigid, her eyes cold. "It's a coincidence. Sarah is dead. I saw the body." Henry snapped the book shut. He stood up slowly. The grief that had crippled him for the last hour evaporated. The tears dried instantly on his cheeks. In their place, a terrifying transformation occurred. The broken boy vanished, and the Wolf of Wall Street, the man who dismantled companies for sport and gutted competitors without blinking, took his place. His posture straightened. His face became a mask of stone. The temperature in the clearing seemed to drop 10 degrees. He turned to his mother. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He spoke with the quiet, lethal calm of a man passing a death sentence. "You have exactly 1 hour," Henry said. Martha blinked, confused by the shift. "What?" "1 hour to pack a bag," Henry clarified, checking his Patek Philippe. "Because after tonight, you are never stepping foot in my house again." "Your house?" Martha laughed nervously, a high-pitched titter. "Henry, be reasonable. The stress is making you hallucinate." "Stay here," Henry commanded. It wasn't a request. "Do not move. Do not speak. If you try to run, I will have the state troopers hunt you down like a fugitive." He pulled his encrypted satellite phone from his jacket pocket. He dialed a number he usually reserved for corporate espionage and crisis management. "This is Cole," Henry said into the phone, turning his back on his mother to look into the dark, deep woods where the little girl had vanished. "Wake up the research team. I need a level 1 background check on the entire county of Black Creek." He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. "I need every birth record from the last 7 years," Henry continued, his voice devoid of mercy. "And run a cross-reference on any Jane Doe filings, welfare checks, or unregistered tenants in the flood zones. I'm looking for a ghost." He hung up the phone and looked at the trees. The potter's field was silent, but the earth beneath his feet no longer felt like a grave. It felt like a crime scene, and Henry Cole was about to solve it. Henry left his mother under the watchful, terrifying silence of his driver, Victor, inside the idling Escalade. He didn't say a word to her. He didn't need to. The look he gave her, a look devoid of sun, devoid of mercy, was a cage more effective than any prison cell. He walked the 3 blocks to the Black Creek Sheriff's Station. The wind cut through his ruined suit, but Henry was burning with a cold, internal fever. The station was a squat, cinder block building that smelled of stale coffee and hopelessness. Henry kicked the door open, the bell above it jangling pitifully. Sheriff Jim Miller sat behind a scarred wooden desk, nursing a styrofoam cup. He looked up, his eyes widening. Jim had been the quarterback when Henry was a receiver. Now, at 32, Jim looked 50, bloated by cheap beer and weighed down by the secrets of a dying town. "Henry?" Jim started to stand, a nervous smile forming. "I heard you were back. I was meaning to come pay my respect." Slam! Henry brought the water-stained sketchbook down onto the desk with the force of a gavel. The sound cracked like a whip in the small room. "Sit down, Jim," Henry said. His voice was quiet, deadly calm. Jim sank back into his chair, the smile vanishing. "What is this? You look like hell, Henry." "This," Henry pointed a trembling finger at the charcoal drawing of his younger self, "was drawn last week by my wife." Jim's eyes flickered to the book, then away. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Henry, we've been over this. Martha filed the report years ago. Overdose. Body couldn't be viewed. Don't lie to me," Henry roared, leaning over the desk until he was nose to nose with the lawman. "My mother is a liar, but you swore an oath. If you lie to me right now, Jim, I swear to God I will bring the entire legal weight of New York City down on this department. I will have the FBI audit every ticket, every seizure, every cent that has passed through this office. I will bury you under so much litigation your grandchildren will be born in debt." Jim stared at Henry. He saw the power there. He saw the billions. He saw the inevitable destruction of his small, fragile life. The sheriff slumped. The fight went out of him like air from a punctured tire. He reached into his bottom drawer and pulled out a bottle of Jack Daniels and 2 glasses. "Sit down, Henry," Jim whispered, pouring a shot with a shaking hand. "You're not going to like this." Henry remained standing. "Talk." Jim downed the whiskey in one burn. He wiped his mouth. "She's not dead. But she might wish she was." "Where is she?" "Let me finish." Jim held up a hand. 7 years ago, right after you left for New York, Martha came to me. She told the whole town Sarah had run off with a dealer from Kentucky, said she abandoned the family to chase a high. "And you believed her?" "No." Jim looked down at his desk. "But Martha owns half the town council, Henry. You know that. And she had leverage on Sarah." "What leverage?" Henry demanded. "Sarah had nothing." "She had the baby," Jim said softly. The room went silent. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a buzzing sound that seemed to drill into Henry's skull. "What?" Henry asked, his voice failing him. "She was pregnant when you got on that bus, Henry." Jim looked up, his eyes full of pity. "About 4 months along. She was hiding it because she didn't want to stop you from leaving. She knew if you knew, you'd stay and work the mines." Henry gripped the edge of the desk so hard his knuckles turned white. Pregnant. A child. He had a child. Martha found out. Jim continued, the words tumbling out now that the dam had broken. "She went to Sarah's trailer. She told Sarah that if she ever tried to contact you, if she ever tried to ruin your bright future with a bastard child, she would call Child Protective Services. She told Sarah she'd pay judges to declare her unfit, negligent. She swore she'd have the baby taken away and put in the worst foster care in the state." Henry felt like he was being strangled. His mother. His own mother had weaponized his child against his wife. "So Sarah took the deal," Jim said, pouring another drink. "She agreed to disappear, to become a ghost. She moved down to the flood zone so Martha wouldn't see her. She scrapes copper to feed the kid. She lives in hell, Henry, just to keep that little girl out of the system." "The girl?" Henry whispered, the image of the hazel-eyed scavenger in the graveyard flashing in his mind. Miss Jane's dog. 7 years old. "Yeah," Jim nodded. "Lily, she named her Lily." Henry grabbed the bottle of whiskey and hurled it against the wall. It shattered, the amber liquid dripping down like blood. "Where?" Henry rasped. "The bottoms," Jim said, standing up. "The old FEMA trailers down by the river. Nobody goes down there, Henry. It's a swamp." "It's where people go to die." Henry didn't wait for another word. He turned and sprinted out of the station. He didn't go back to the car. He didn't go back to the driver. He ran toward the edge of town, toward the darkness of the woods, toward the river. He ran with the desperation of a man who had lost a decade, tearing off his $6,000 jacket and throwing it into the mud as he went. He wasn't a billionaire anymore. He was a husband. He was a father, and he was coming for them. Henry Cole didn't just run, he plummeted. He tore through the dense tree line behind the sheriff's station, plunging into the black abyss of the woods like a man diving into a grave. The terrain dropped sharply, the solid ground of the town giving way to the treacherous, slick mud of the ravine known as the Bottoms. Branches whipped his face, drawing blood, but he didn't feel it. The bespoke Italian loafers designed for the plush carpets of Manhattan boardrooms offered no traction on the freezing West Virginia clay. He slipped, sliding 10 feet down a muddy embankment, tearing the knees of his trousers and coating his hands in slime. He scrambled up, gasping for air, and kept moving. The sheriff was right. This wasn't a neighborhood, it was a scar on the earth. The Bottoms was a desolate stretch of floodplain where the river frequently burst its banks, leaving behind a permanent stench of rot, sewage, and stagnant despair. As Henry broke through the final line of trees, the homes came into view. They were the rotting husks of FEMA trailers left over from a disaster a decade ago, now rusted through and sinking into the swampy earth. There were no streetlights here. The only illumination came from the erratic flicker of kerosene lamps and the pale moonlight filtering through the bare branches. Henry stopped, his chest heaving, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He scanned the darkness. There, at the very edge of the water, sat a structure that barely qualified as shelter. It was a rusted metal box propped up on uneven cinder blocks. The windows were gone, replaced by thick sheets of blue tarp duct taped to the aluminum siding to keep out the biting wind. A thin plume of black smoke rose from a stovepipe jutting out of the roof at a crooked angle. It looked less like a home and more like a metal coffin refusing to be buried. Henry moved forward, his footsteps silent in the soft mud. He approached the trailer with the terrifying reverence of a man approaching an altar. As he got closer, the sound of the wind died down and he heard voices. "Mama, the rich man was nice," a small voice whispered. It was Lily, the girl from the graveyard. "He gave me chocolate, real chocolate, not the Dollar General kind." Henry froze, pressing his back against the cold, vibrating metal of the trailer. He held his breath, tears instantly welling in his eyes. "Hush, Lily," a woman's voice replied. It wasn't the melodic, vibrant voice Henry remembered. It was a rasp, weak, wheezing and trembling with exhaustion. "We don't talk to strangers, especially the rich ones. They are dangerous." "But he was sad, Mama. He was crying over Miss Jane's dog grave. And then the dragon lady came. She screamed at me." There was a pause, followed by the sound of coughing, a deep, wet rattle that sounded like fluid in the lungs. "The dragon lady?" The woman's voice broke, filled with terrified recognition. "Listen to me, baby. We have to be quiet. If she knows we were there, if she knows you saw him, she'll call the men in the uniforms. Do you remember what I told you about the uniforms?" "They take me away," Lily recited, her voice small and fearful. "They put me in a cage and I never see you again." "That's right," the woman whispered. "So we stay hidden. We stay invisible, like ghosts." Henry couldn't listen anymore. His heart shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Invisible. Martha had turned his family into fugitives in their own town. He stepped around to the side of the trailer where the tarp acted as a door. He gripped the plastic sheeting. His hand shook violently. He wasn't afraid of what he would see. He was afraid that the sight would kill him. He ripped the tarp aside. "Sarah?" The inside of the trailer was a scene from a nightmare. It was lit by a single kerosene lantern. The air was thick with the smell of mold and unwashed bodies. Piles of stripped copper wire sat in the corner, next to a bucket catching rainwater from the leaking roof. And there, huddled on a mattress on the floor, was Sarah. Henry gasped. The sound punched out of him. She was 30 years old, but she looked 50. Her once lustrous chestnut hair was now streaked with premature gray and matted with sweat. Her face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over her cheekbones, her eyes sunken in dark, bruised sockets. Her hands, the hands that used to sketch birds with delicate precision, were raw, calloused, and wrapped in dirty bandages from stripping wire without tools. But it was her leg that stopped Henry's heart. Her left leg was twisted at a sickening, unnatural angle beneath the blanket. It was a break, that had never been set by a doctor, a bone that had healed wrong, leaving her crippled and in constant agony. "No!" Sarah screamed, a sound of pure, primal terror. She scrambled backward on the mattress, dragging her useless leg, grabbing Lily and pulling the child behind her wasted body. She grabbed a rusty screwdriver from the floor, wielding it like a knife. "Don't take her!" Sarah shrieked, her eyes wild and unseeing in the dim light. "You can't have her. Tell Martha I didn't say anything. I kept the promise. I stayed dead." "Sarah, no." Henry stepped into the trailer, his hands raised. "Get back," she wailed, swinging the screwdriver. "I'm dead. Tell him I'm dead. Leave my baby alone." The sheer magnitude of her trauma hit Henry like a physical blow. She didn't see her husband. She saw an agent of the woman who had enslaved her. Henry didn't walk to her. He fell. He collapsed to his knees on the rotting plywood floor, heedless of the filth. He bowed his head, his forehead touching the dirty floorboards, his posture one of total, abject surrender. "It's me," Henry sobbed, his voice broken and raw. "It's Henry. Bluebird. It's me." The nickname hung in the stagnant air. Sarah's hand froze mid-swing. The screwdriver trembled. She stared at the man on the floor, the man in the ruined $6,000 suit, weeping into the dirt of her hovel. "Henry?" she whispered, the name sounding foreign on her tongue. Henry looked up, his face streaming with tears. "I didn't know. I swear to God, Sarah, I didn't know. I thought you were gone. I thought—" He crawled forward inch by inch until he reached the mattress. Sarah didn't strike him. She dropped the screwdriver. Her hands, shaking uncontrollably, reached out and touched his face, tracing the jawline she had drawn in charcoal just days ago. "You're real?" she asked, her voice cracking. "I'm real," Henry choked out. He wrapped his arms around her frail, broken body, burying his face in her neck. He pulled Lily into the embrace, holding them both with a desperation that threatened to crush them. "I'm here," Henry whispered into her hair as she finally collapsed against him, wailing out 7 years of pain. "I'm here, and I am going to burn the world down for what they did to you." The sun rose over Black Creek, not with warmth, but with a cold, revealing light that stripped the shadows from the valley. It illuminated the decaying main street, the frozen river, and the white marble columns of the coal estate, which stood on the hill like a tombstone for a conscience long dead. The silence of the morning was shattered by violence. Crash. The double oak doors of the mansion doors that cost more than Sarah's entire trailer flew open as Henry Cole kicked them in, the wood splintering around the lock. He stepped into the foyer, a vengeful god returning to his temple. He was covered in the muck of the flood zone, his $6,000 suit ruined, his face streaked with sweat and mud. But he stood taller than he ever had in the boardrooms of Manhattan. In his arms he carried Sarah. She was light, terrifyingly light, her body frail against his chest. Her twisted leg dangled painfully, wrapped in dirty bandages. Clinging to Henry's pant leg was Lily, her hazel eyes wide with terror as she entered the castle of the Dragon Lady. "Henry?" Martha Cole was in the living room, frantically shoving jewelry and silverware into a Louis Vuitton duffel bag. She froze, a silver candelabra halfway into the bag. She looked at the trio standing in her foyer, the billionaire son, the dead wife, and the secret grandchild, and the color drained from her face until she looked like a corpse. Henry didn't say a word. He walked past her, his muddy boots leaving thick black streaks on the pristine Italian marble floor. He walked straight to the living room, to the custom-made velvet sofa covered in protective plastic. "Henry, don't!" Martha gasped, purely out of reflex. "That's imported velvet." Henry looked at her with eyes of ice. With gentle, infinite care, he lowered Sarah onto the sofa. The grime from her clothes, the mud from the swamp, smeared instantly onto the pristine furniture. He ripped the plastic cover off and threw it on the floor, letting Sarah's dirty head rest against the expensive fabric. He picked Lily up and sat her right next to her mother. "It's okay," Henry whispered to them, ignoring the woman trembling across the room. "You rest. The nightmare ends now." He turned to face his mother. The tenderness vanished. The Wolf of Wall Street emerged. I was just packing up some things for cleaning," Martha stammered, dropping the duffel bag. It clattered heavily, betraying the weight of the stolen silver inside. "I didn't know you were bringing company." Henry walked to the coffee table. He pulled a thick stack of papers from his inside jacket pocket, documents his forensic accounting team in New York had emailed to his phone, and which he had printed at the sheriff's station at 4 a.m. He threw the stack onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud. "I tracked the accounts, Martha," Henry said. His voice wasn't loud. It was the terrifyingly quiet voice of a man reading a death sentence. Martha flinched. "Henry, I can explain." $5 million, Henry cut her off, pointing at the papers. "That is the amount I wired home over the last 10 years. Money for the house, money for charity, money for Sarah's memorial." He took a step closer. Martha took a step back, hitting the wall. "You bought 3 vacation condos in Boca Raton," Henry recited from memory, his eyes boring into hers. "You spent $400,000 on a Lincoln Navigator. You lost $500,000 on online poker sites. And you spent $50,000 on handbags." He gestured violently toward the sofa where Sarah lay shivering, her crippled leg exposed. "You let my wife's leg heal crooked because you stole the money for the surgery," Henry hissed, stepping into her personal space. "You let my daughter eat out of garbage cans while you wore Chanel. You lived like a queen on the blood of my family." Martha's face crumbled. She dropped to her knees, grasping at his ruined trousers. "I did it for you, Henry, don't you see? She was a waitress. She would have been an anchor around your neck. You would have stayed here, working the mines, dying of black lung like your father. I freed you. I made you a billionaire." Henry looked down at her. He felt nothing. No love, no hate, just the clinical detachment of excising a tumor. "You didn't make me a billionaire, Mother," Henry said cold. "You made me an orphan." He pulled a thin envelope from his pocket. "I am not calling the police," Henry said. Martha looked up, hope sparking in her eyes. "Oh, thank God. I knew you wouldn't. The scandal." "I am not calling them because I will not have Lily's first memory of this house be her grandmother in handcuffs," Henry continued, crushing her hope instantly. "But make no mistake, this is not mercy." He tossed the envelope onto the floor. It contained 5 $100 bills. "You have $500, Henry said. "That is more than you gave Sarah in 7 years." "Henry, please." "This house is in my name," Henry stated, his voice ringing like steel. "The cars are in my name. The accounts are frozen. I shut them down 10 minutes ago. Your credit cards are dead. Your country club membership is revoked." He pointed to the door he had kicked open. "Get out." "Where will I go?" Martha wailed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her makeup. "I have nothing. I'm 60 years old." "You have your health," Henry said, echoing the words she had likely used to justify abandoning Sarah. "And you have your freedom, which is more than you gave them." He leaned down, his face inches from hers. "If you ever come within 100 miles of my wife or my daughter again, if I ever see your name on a document or hear your voice on a phone, I will unleash every lawyer in New York. I will prosecute you for fraud, for embezzlement, and for child endangerment until you die in a federal prison cell." Martha looked into his eyes and saw the truth. Her son was gone. The boy she manipulated was dead. Standing before her was a titan she could not control. She stood up, shaking. She grabbed the handle of her suitcase, her knuckles white. She looked once at the luxury she had stolen, then at Sarah, who refused to meet her gaze. Martha Cole walked out the door. She walked out into the cold morning air, her heels clicking on the marble for the last time. She walked past the Escalade she would never ride in again, dragging her suitcase down the long, winding driveway, exiled from the kingdom she had built on lies. Henry watched her go until she was just a speck in the distance. Then, he closed the broken door. He turned around, looked at his wife and daughter huddled on the velvet sofa, and for the first time in 10 years, the house felt warm. 3 months. 90 days. That was all it took for the seasons to change, for the winter of West Virginia to bleed into the blossoming spring of Manhattan. Henry Cole stood on the terrace of his penthouse, 50 stories above Central Park. The city below was a grid of diamonds, humming with the frenetic energy of 8 million souls chasing dreams. But up here, in the glass eyrie he had once used only to sleep between mergers, there was a profound, sacred silence. He turned from the railing to watch the living room through the floor-to-ceiling glass. Sarah was there. She was moving across the room, one hand lightly tracing the back of a velvet sofa, real velvet, soft and warm. Not covered in plastic. She held a cane made of polished ebony, but she didn't lean on it with the desperation of a cripple. She used it as an accessory to her grace. The top orthopedic surgeons in Switzerland had re-broken and set her leg 3 days after they arrived in New York. They had inserted titanium rods and reconstructed the atrophied muscle. It wasn't perfect. She would always have a slight limp, a physical memory of her survival, but she was walking. Her hair, once matted with the gray of stress and coal dust, was now a cascade of rich chestnut, shining under the warm, recessed lighting. She wore a dress of soft cream cashmere that draped over a body that was no longer skeletal. She had filled out, the hollows of her cheeks replaced by the soft flush of health. She paused by the window, catching Henry's eye. She smiled. It wasn't the terrified grimace of the woman in the trailer. It was the smile of the girl at the bus station 10 years ago, only deeper, wiser, and infinitely more precious. But the true miracle was the sound filling the apartment. Plink, plink, plink. 7-year-old Lily sat at a Steinway grand piano that cost more than the entire town of Black Creek. Her small hands, which had spent years calloused and bleeding from stripping copper wire, were now clean, soft, and dancing over the ivory keys. She messed up a scale, hitting a discordant note. In the past, a mistake meant a scream from the Dragon Lady. A mistake meant danger. Lily froze for a second. Then she threw her head back and laughed a sound like silver bells. "Try again, baby," Sarah encouraged gently, walking over to smooth her daughter's hair. Middle C. Henry felt a lump form in his throat, thick and hard. He reached into his pocket, his hand brushing against his phone. It buzzed. He pulled it out. The caller ID read Black Creek Project Manager. Henry slid the glass door open and stepped back out onto the terrace to take the call, the chill of the New York spring bracing him. "Talk to me," Henry said. The voice was still the master of the universe, authoritative, commanding, but the edge of cruelty was gone. "Mr. Cole," the contractor's voice crackled on the line, "we're ready. The demolition crew has placed the charges, but I just want to confirm, you're sure? The foundation is solid. We could just renovate the interior. It's a $5 million structure." Henry looked out at the skyline. He thought of the white pillars. He thought of the plastic-covered furniture. He thought of the cold, sterile mausoleum where his mother had tried to bury his family's existence. "I don't want a renovation," Henry said, his voice flat. "I want an exorcism." "Understood, sir." "Burn it down," Henry commanded. "Level it. I want every piece of marble crushed, and when the dust settles, you start pouring the foundation for the clinic, the Sarah Cole Community Center, free legal aid, free pediatric care, and a scholarship fund for every kid in the bottoms." "Yes, sir," initiating demolition in T-10. Henry hung up. He didn't need to hear the explosion. He felt it in his soul, a heavy weight finally lifting, turning to ash, and drifting away on the wind. The fortress of greed was gone. Henry? He turned. Sarah was standing in the open doorway of the terrace. The wind caught her dress, making her look like an angel. "Dinner is ready," she said softly. "Lily wants to show you her new song." Henry slid the phone into his pocket. He looked at the device that controlled billions of dollars, realizing it was the least valuable thing he owned. "I'm coming," he said. He walked back inside, leaving the cold city behind. He sat at the head of the dining table, not as a CEO, but as a husband. Lily looked up from her plate of roast chicken. No more protein bars, no more scraps. "Daddy?" she asked, the words still feeling new and miraculous in the air. "Did you hear me play?" "I heard you, Bluebird." Henry smiled, reaching out to cover Sarah's hand with his own. Her skin was warm. Her pulse was steady. "It was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Henry Cole looked at his wife, whose eyes sparkled with the same hazel gold fire as his own. He looked at his daughter, who was safe, fed, and loved. For 10 years, he had chased numbers on a screen, thinking that was power. He had climbed the mountain of capitalism only to find the peak was cold and lonely. But here, in the warmth of this room, surrounded by the people he had almost lost to his own ambition, the king of Wall Street finally understood. He hadn't returned to Black Creek to save them. They had saved him. He squeezed Sarah's hand, feeling the solid reality of her wedding ring, the new one, platinum and eternal against his palm. "I'm home," Henry whispered, finally at peace. "I'm finally home." Henry Cole's journey reveals the stark difference between net worth and self-worth. For a decade, he conquered Wall Street, believing money was the ultimate scorecard, only to discover his empire was built on a foundation of loss. True poverty wasn't the trailer in the flood zone. It was the cold, empty mansion on the hill. The story serves as a powerful reminder that ambition is meaningless without humanity, and the most expensive things in life, time, trust, and love, cannot be bought. Ultimately, a man is not measured by the size of his bank account, but by who is waiting for him at the dinner table. Now, if you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know which part surprised you the most. Every subscription and comment from you is a huge motivation for us to keep sharing more meaningful stories in life. Thank you so much.